There was a time when the sound of gunfire decided whether he would live to see another sunrise. A time when fear had a face, when loss had a name, and survival was never guaranteed. Now, nearly 60, the only sounds in his life are the wind through pine trees, the creak of a wooden porch, and the steady footsteps of a loyal dog walking at his side. But some wounds never truly close, and some battles, no matter how long ago they ended, have a way of finding you again when you least expect it. On the morning the fog rolled into his quiet town, a forgotten piece of land appeared on his desk, and with it, a door to a past that refused to stay buried. Before we get started, help us grow by subscribing. Morning fog rested low over the edge of the small town, blurring the line between the last row of houses and the wide stretch of empty fields beyond. Samuel Pierce stepped out onto the narrow porch of his wooden home just as the pale sun began to lift through the mist, its light dull and hesitant, like the town itself. At 59, he moved slower than he once had, but there was still a quiet steadiness to the way he stood, tall and slightly lean, shoulders broad beneath the red and black buffalo plaid shirt jacket he wore every day without exception. Beneath it showed the soft edge of a cream-colored t-shirt, clean but worn thin at the collar. His dark blue jeans had faded at the knees, and his brown leather boots carried the subtle curve of years of loyal use. On his left wrist, the military watch rested like a second pulse, ticking with quiet persistence. Shadow, his German shepherd, waited at the foot of the steps, alert and motionless, amber eyes tracking every drifting sound through the fog. The dog's coat was thick and dark, marked by a few faint, pale scars along the shoulder and hind leg. Old reminders of a life before Samuel, a life neither of them ever spoke about. When Samuel descended the steps, Shadow rose immediately and fell into pace beside him, neither tugging nor lagging, their rhythm one learned through long habit rather than command. They walked the same route each morning, past the closed hardware store, the silent diner, the old brick post office that no longer received much mail. A few porch lights still glowed faintly as other residents lingered behind their doors, preparing for another day that would look much like the last. Samuel nodded once at a man sweeping his storefront, offered a brief greeting to a woman loading groceries into her car, and moved on without stopping. He was known here well enough. The quiet real estate broker who handled modest listings with patience and a fair hand. The veteran who never spoke about the war. The man who lived alone with his dog at the edge of town and kept his yard neat without making a show of it. People trusted him, but they did not truly know him. And in some way, that was how Samuel preferred it. Inside him, beneath the routines and the steady work, lived a silence deeper than the town's own. Some mornings, like this one, it was peaceful. Other mornings, it was heavy with memory, the weight of faces that no longer existed, the echo of choices that could never be undone. Shadow sensed those days without needing to be told. On them, the dog walked closer, his shoulder brushing Samuel's leg with deliberate gentleness, as if reminding the man where the present still lived. After their walk, Samuel returned home to make coffee in the small, tidy kitchen. The radio murmured softly from the counter, a local voice reciting weather reports and farm prices with the calm assurance of someone who had never needed to raise it. He poured a second bowl of water for Shadow, who drank with quiet enthusiasm before settling near the back door. Facing outward, Samuel reviewed the day's appointments at the small table by the window. Neat stacks of paperwork, aligned with careful precision. There were routine viewings, minor closings, a handful of phone calls to return. Nothing urgent, nothing new. And yet, beneath the familiar rhythm, something in him felt unsettled without a clear reason. He folded the list, slid it into his jacket pocket, and paused briefly with his hand resting flat against his chest, as if checking an invisible compass. Old instinct, he told himself, the kind that never fully sleeps, no matter how many quiet years pass. When he finished dressing, Shadow rose at once, tail lifting slightly, eyes quick with readiness. The world outside still held no obvious danger, but Shadow's attention wasn't meant for threat alone. It was meant for movement, change, and the things that arrived without warning. The afternoon unfolded at a slow, ordinary pace. Samuel showed a small farmhouse to a young couple from a nearby town, listened patiently as they spoke about gardens and schools and how the light would fall through the kitchen windows. He pointed out the solid beams in the basement, the age of the roof, the quiet slope of the land. He did his job as he always did, honestly, thoroughly, without embellishment. When they left, grateful and hopeful, he wished them well and meant it. The world needed more simple beginnings like theirs. It was after that final showing, as the sun began to tilt westward and cast long gold shadows across the roads, that the shift came, the kind that no schedule ever accounts for. Samuel returned to his small office on the corner of Main and Third, unlocked the door, and stepped inside to find a new file waiting on his desk. No message accompanied it. No appointment had been made, just a thin folder with faded edges and a single property address printed on the front in blunt black ink. Shadow's ears lifted as soon as the door closed behind them, his body stiffening by a fraction. Samuel noticed at once. He sat slowly, opening the folder with measured care. The property description was brief, too brief. Acreage listed without flourish. Price set far below anything comparable within 50 miles. No recent photographs. No long history of transfers. No justification for the scarcity of detail. Samuel felt a tightening behind his ribs that had nothing to do with surprise. He had seen neglected listings before. He had handled distressed sales, abandoned homes, even properties no one wanted to acknowledge anymore. But this felt different. The paper itself seemed to resist explanation, as though the few words printed across it were standing in for something unsaid. Shadow let out a low, almost inaudible sound from near the door. Not a growl, not a bark, but a subtle vibration of warning that caught in the back of Samuel's senses. "Easy, boy," he murmured, without looking up. These words were soft, but the instinct beneath them was sharp. He did not doubt Shadow without reason. He never had. Samuel leaned back in his chair, studying the ceiling for a moment as he considered the folder. He could have ignored it. He could have slid it into the waiting stack of low-priority leads and gone about his evening as planned. But the shape of the emptiness inside him shifted, restless now in a way it had not been that morning. He remembered standing at thresholds long ago, feeling the same quiet tension before doors opened into situations no one could ever fully prepare for. He closed the file once more, tucked it into his briefcase, and shut off the office lights. Outside, the sky had deepened into amber and slate, the wind lifting faintly through the lone maple at the corner. As they walked home, Shadow glanced repeatedly toward the road that led beyond the edge of town, the same direction listed on the file's address. Samuel told himself it meant nothing. Dogs watched many things. Men imagined patterns where none existed. Still, that night, after the lamps were turned low and the house settled into its familiar quiet, Samuel remained awake longer than usual, the folded shape of that thin folder pressing gently at the back of his thoughts, asking questions it was not yet ready to answer. And as sleep finally overtook him, a single uneasy thought lingered. Was this meant to be a beginning, or the echo of something that had never truly ended? Samuel reached the edge of town just as the sun lifted above the low hills, its pale light spreading slowly across the empty fields like something trying to remember how to be warm. Shadow rode beside him with quiet focus, front paws resting against the door, ears shifting toward every sound that drifted in through the cracked window. The road narrowed from clean asphalt to worn gravel, then to a faint dirt track barely wide enough for a single vehicle. Samuel slowed without quite knowing why. The land on either side had the uneasy look of something left behind in stages. Old fence posts leaning at odd angles, patches of tall grass swallowing what once might have been neat rows of farmland. When the small wooden sign with the faded address finally appeared, he felt a subtle tightening in his chest, the same feeling he had learned to listen to long before he ever set foot in this town. He turned in, the truck's tires crunching softly over gravel and weeds, and brought the engine to a stop. Another car was already parked there, an aging sedan with sun-bleached paint and a trunk that bore the shallow dents of a long, practical life. Beside it stood a woman wrapped in a light gray cardigan despite the warming morning. She looked to be in her late 50s, close to Samuel's own age, with a frame neither frail nor strong, but steady, as if she had learned to carry weight without letting it break her posture. Her hair, streaked with silver, was pulled into a loose knot at the back of her head, and her face carried the quiet lines of someone who had spent more years worrying than resting. A faint scar traced the edge of her jaw, pale against her skin. Near her stood a small boy, perhaps 8 or 9, clutching the strap of a worn backpack in both hands. He was thin in the way children sometimes are when they grow faster than their sense of safety can catch up with them, dark hair falling into his eyes as he studied Shadow with careful interest and just enough caution to keep his feet planted where he was. Samuel stepped out, closing the truck door softly behind him. Shadow followed at once, landing lightly and standing still at Samuel's side, his gaze already searching the open space ahead. "Mr. Pierce?" the woman asked. Her voice was gentle but deliberate, the kind shaped by long practice and being careful with words. "Samuel," he answered, offering a small nod. "You must be Emily Hart." She confirmed it with a faint, reserved smile. "And this is Noah," she added, resting a hand lightly on the boy's shoulder. Noah shifted but did not pull away. Samuel met the boy's eyes and nodded once, slow and steady. "Good to meet you, Noah." The boy did not smile, yet his grip on the backpack loosened slightly. He glanced from Samuel to Shadow and back again, curiosity beginning to edge out fear. Emily's eyes lingered on the dog. "He stays close to you," she said. "Shadow," Samuel replied. "He's been doing that a long..." Shadow gave a brief, quiet huff, as if acknowledging his name without distraction, and then his attention drifted back toward the open field beyond them. Emily followed his gaze with an unease she did not try to hide. "This is the place," she said softly. The words carried no pride in ownership, only the weight of memory. Ahead of them, the faint outline of a foundation emerged through the tall grass, flat stone lines where rooms had once held walls and life. The remains were ordinary enough on their own, yet something in the air around them felt unsettled, as if the ground itself had never fully accepted what had been taken from it. They began, walking slowly toward the foundation, their steps measured. Samuel kept his pace easy, careful not to crowd the woman or the child. Shadow moved slightly ahead, nose low, tracing invisible paths that curled and crossed through the weeds. At first, his movements were calm and habitual. Then, as they reached the edge of what might once have been a kitchen or living room, his body stiffened. A low sound rolled out of his chest. Not a bark, not a snarl, but a warning that seemed to vibrate through the quiet morning. Samuel stopped at once, his hand lowering to rest between the dog's shoulders. "Easy," he murmured. Shadow did not retreat, but his ears flattened a fraction, his attention fixed on a patch of ground that looked no different from any other. Emily had gone unnaturally still behind him. When Samuel turned, he saw that her face had faded several shades paler. Her eyes locked on the far edge of the clearing where the tree line rose in shadowed layers. For a long moment, she seemed to see something no longer there. "You've been here before," Samuel said quietly. It was not an accusation, only an observation shaped by instinct. Emily drew in a slow breath and let it out through pressed lips. "My daughter lived here with her husband," she said, "and Noah." Her hand tightened on the boy's shoulder. Noah's eyes dropped to the ground. "Before everything changed?" No one asked her to explain how. The silence that followed spoke all it needed to for now. As they continued along the boundary of the old foundation, Emily told him what little the town records would confirm, that the family had vanished several years back without clear explanation. No bodies, no official answers, just absence that settled in and was slowly treated as if it had always belonged there. "They said it was easier not to look too hard," she added, her voice controlled but strained. "Easier for everyone to pretend." Samuel absorbed the words without comment, a familiar tightening resting behind his ribs. He had heard similar explanations in places far from this quiet town. Different faces, same reasoning. They moved from stone outline to overgrown path, and then to the gentle slope where the yard had once opened toward the fields. Shadow ranged a little farther now, circling wide, his growl returning in short, subdued bursts whenever his nose caught something the others could not sense. He returned repeatedly to Samuel's side, pressing his weight against the man's leg in brief moments of contact that felt less like fear and more like warning. Emily watched the dog with an expression that wavered between unease and something like reluctant trust. "He knows," she said at last. "Dogs always know first." Samuel did not contradict her. They spoke little after that. Samuel asked simple questions about property lines and utilities. Emily answered when she could, sometimes hesitating, as if unsure whether the answers mattered anymore. Noah listened without appearing to listen, trailing behind them, his steps careful where Shadow had just passed. Once, when Samuel glanced back, he saw the boy reach out, as if to touch the dog's tail, only to withdraw his hand at the last moment. Shadow sensed the movement and turned his head, meeting the boy's gaze without tension. For a brief moment, something softened in Noah's face, a flicker of wonder that cut through his guarded stillness. When they came to a stop near what might once have been the front of the house, Emily folded her arms loosely against herself. "I don't know why the price is so low," she said. "Or maybe I do, and I just don't want to say it out loud." Samuel studied the empty space where a doorway might have stood. "Sometimes land gets priced for more than what grows on it," he replied. "Sometimes it's priced for what people are afraid to remember." Emily looked at him for a long moment, then gave a quiet, joyless laugh. "That sounds like something you'd say if you'd lived too long with ghosts." Samuel did not deny it. They stood there together, the three of them and the dog, surrounded by wind and grass and the faint traces of what had been. The town lay invisible beyond the rise, close enough to claim proximity, yet far enough to maintain its distance. Samuel felt the land working on him in the same slow, patient way time had always worked, layer by layer, asking no permission. He sensed the unspoken question pulsing beneath Emily's guarded calm, beneath Noah's careful steps, beneath Shadow's restless vigilance. Whatever had happened here still cast a shadow long enough to touch them all. "I don't have answers for you," Samuel said at last, his voice low. "Not today." Emily nodded. "I didn't expect you to." She glanced down at Noah, then back at Samuel. "I only wanted someone to finally walk this place without pretending it didn't exist." Samuel looked out across the field again, his hand resting on Shadow's broad back. He realized that he, too, had come for more than a listing. The price on the paper no longer mattered in the way it had before. This land was weighted with something that refused to stay buried. And as he stood between a woman marked by quiet loss, a child learning to live inside its echo, and a dog that would not stop warning him of what lay unseen, a single thought pressed gently but firmly into his awareness. This was no ordinary piece of forgotten ground. What exactly had happened here that the land itself still seemed unable to let go? The quiet that followed Samuel's visit to the forgotten lot did not bring him peace the way silence usually did. Instead, it lingered like a held breath that never quite released. For several days after, he moved through the familiar routines of his work with an edge of distraction he could not shake. He found himself noticed small inconsistencies where he had once passed by without question. A date that didn't match a signature. A deed filed under a category that didn't quite fit. A transfer recorded with a precision that felt almost too deliberate. Each detail alone meant very little. Together, they began to sketch the faint outline of something that refused to stay buried beneath paperwork and time. Late one afternoon, alone in his office, with the low lamp burning against the gathering dusk, Samuel spread the documents across his desk in quiet rows. Shadow lay at his feet, eyes open, tracking the rhythm of Samuel's movements. "You feel it too, don't you?" Samuel murmured. The dog's tail gave a single, slow tap against the floor. Somewhere beneath the numbers and the ink, something was wrong. The records told a story that had been edited rather than erased. Transfers recorded months after they should have occurred. Notations altered with a different pen stroke, the pressure heavier, the letters just slightly impatient. A property that moved too easily between hands for a place no one supposedly wanted. Samuel felt the old sensation return, the one he had lived with in another life, when small details had meant the difference between danger seen in time and danger discovered too late. It had followed him across continents and back again, and now it seemed to have found him in a modest office in a quiet town that prided itself on being ordinary. By the time he closed the last folder, the truth had not yet fully formed in his mind. But one thing was clear enough. Whatever had happened on that land had not ended by accident. And someone, somewhere, had taken the trouble to make sure the story remained unfinished in just the right way. It was early evening when the knock came at his door. Not the light, uncertain tap of a buyer or a neighbor, but a firmer sound, heavy with expectation. Shadow rose at once, moving between Samuel and the door without being told. Samuel straightened, took a steady breath, and opened it. 3 men stood on the narrow sidewalk. All appeared local by the worn ease of their clothes and the absence of curiosity in their eyes. The first was tall and broad-shouldered, perhaps in his late 40s, with close-cropped dark hair and a jaw set as if it had learned long ago not to yield. The second was shorter, stockier, his movements compact and deliberate, a faint scar curling down from the corner of his right eye, like a question mark that never quite found its answer. The third stood half a step behind the others, lean and narrow, with pale blonde hair and eyes that shifted too often, never fully settling on Samuel's face for more than a second at a time. None of them looked like men who spent their days worrying over zoning laws or closing costs. "Mr. Pierce," the tall one said, his tone casual enough to almost pass as polite. "We were hoping to have a word with you about a piece of property you've been looking into." Samuel did not step aside, nor did he move to block the exit. He simply held his ground. "If you want to talk business, you can call the office during regular hours," he replied. "That's how it usually works." The stockier man smiled faintly, the scar at his eye shifting with the motion. "Usually, sure," he said, "but sometimes situations benefit from a more personal touch." Shadow let out a low growl that rolled through the sudden space between them like a distant warning of thunder. The lean man behind them flinched at the sound, then recovered quickly, his mouth tightening. The tall one glanced down at the dog and then back at Samuel with a hint of impatience. "There's no need for that," he said. "We're just here to make you a fair offer, a generous one." He reached into his jacket and produced a folded document, holding it out as if the air itself were an extension of the deal. "For the land." Samuel did not take the paper. "It isn't mine to sell," he said evenly. "Not yet." The tall man's smile thinned, a crease forming at the edge of his mouth. "You're the one listed on the inquiry. You've been walking it, talking to people. That makes it your problem, at least for now." Shadow's growl deepened. Not a problem, Samuel corrected. Just work. The stockier man shifted his weight, boots scraping lightly against the concrete. Work that doesn't pay nearly as well as it could, he said. He named a figure without raising his voice. It was more than double the asking price of the land, high enough to turn most hesitation into sudden enthusiasm. Samuel felt the weight of the number register in his body without changing his expression. Why would you offer that for something no one wants? He asked quietly. The lean man's eyes darted again, this time too fast to hide. The tall one's gaze sharpened. People want different things at different times. The silence stretched thin and tense between them. Shadow took one deliberate step forward, placing himself fully between the men and Samuel now, his posture calm, but unmistakably ready. The stockier man glanced again at the dog, annoyance flickering across his face. You're making this harder than it needs to be, he said. We're trying to keep things simple. Samuel's hands remained relaxed at his sides, but the old instincts waited just beneath the surface, coiled and alert. Simple for who? He asked. The tall man's jaw tightened. For everyone, he replied, and the word carried a note that did not sound like reassurance. After a moment, he folded the paper back into his jacket. Think it over, he said. We'll check back soon. They turned without another word and walked away down the sidewalk, the lean one glancing back once over his shoulder, as if already measuring the distance between now and whatever came next. That night, Samuel did not sleep easily. The shape of the offer and the manner in which it had been delivered pressed against his thoughts. Money offered too quickly was often the most dangerous kind. Shadow lay near the foot of the bed, eyes half open, breathing slow but vigilant. By morning, Samuel had made his choice, even if he had not yet spoken it aloud. He returned to the forgotten lot before noon, under the reasonable excuse of further inspection, paperwork in hand, tension riding quietly beneath his steady exterior. Emily and Noah were already there. Emily stood near the edge of the old foundation, a folded sweater resting over one arm. Noah sat on a fallen beam nearby, legs swinging slowly, his attention fixed on the dog as Shadow approached at Samuel's side. They came to see you, didn't they? Emily asked, without preamble, her voice low and certain. Samuel studied her face. The question was not newly formed. It had simply found its moment. Yes, he said, and they weren't here to offer help. Emily's mouth pressed into a thin line. They never are. Samuel had barely finished the sentence when the crunch of gravel announced approaching vehicles. 2 trucks rolled into the clearing and stopped at a careful distance. The same 3 men stepped out, joined now by another pair who remained closer to the vehicles. One of the newcomers was older, late 50s perhaps. His posture stooped, but his eyes sharp beneath a brimmed cap pulled low. The other was younger, broad through the chest with restless energy in the way he moved. As though violence were an option he kept close at hand. Shadow's reaction was immediate. His body stiffened, and he moved outright between Emily, Noah, and the approaching men, his growl cutting through the open air with a sharper edge than before. Noah froze, eyes wide. Emily stepped back by instinct, one hand reaching for her grandson. The tall man lifted a palm in mock peace. Easy there, he called. We don't mean to cause trouble. Shadow answered with another warning rumble, lower and more insistent. Samuel stepped forward half a pace, placing himself beside the dog. You're already doing that, he said quietly. The men advanced a few steps anyway, the space between them tightening like a drawn cord. The stockier one smiled again, the scar at his eye pulling. "We heard you were still interested," he said. "Thought we'd save you the trouble of chasing paperwork." The tall one named the higher figure this time, adding another sum on top of the last, as if to test how large an offer it would take to rewrite a man's decisions. Emily let out a short, incredulous breath. "You never cared about that land before," she said, the words trembling between fear and anger. "You told everyone it was worthless." The tall man's eyes slid to her for the first time with open irritation. Things change. Samuel felt the moment shift. The offer was no longer staged as persuasion, but as pressure dressed in numbers. "You're standing on something you don't understand," the stockier man added, his voice lowering by a degree that sharpened it. "We're trying to make sure you don't learn the hard way." Shadow's teeth flashed briefly in a silent bearing that made the younger man behind them shift his footing. The air felt thick enough to choke on. Samuel looked from one face to another. He saw calculation where courtesy should have been, impatience where negotiation belonged. He saw the faint beginnings of fear behind the threat. "If you want the land," he said evenly, "you'll go through lawful channels like everyone else." The tall man laughed softly. "You really believe that still matters?" he asked. The question hung in the space between them, like a challenge. Samuel did not answer at once. His gaze slid instead to Emily and the boy, then back to Shadow, standing rigid at his side, every sense tuned to the line the men were inching closer to crossing. In that moment, Samuel understood something with a clarity that cut through any lingering uncertainty. This was no longer about property lines or commissions or even simple greed measured in figures too large for the page. The past tied to this place had weight, and those men had been carrying it with them longer than they cared to admit. "You should leave," Samuel said at last, his voice calm and unwavering. The tall man's smile disappeared completely. For a heartbeat, none of them moved. Then, with a curt gesture, he turned back toward the trucks. "You've been warned," he said without looking back. As the vehicles pulled away, dust rising in their wake, the clearing felt suddenly vast and exposed. Shadow remained on guard long after the engines faded from hearing. Emily exhaled slowly, her shoulders trembling. "They won't stop now," she said. It wasn't alarm so much as weary certainty. Samuel watched the drifting dust settle back onto the land. He felt the truth of her words settle with it. Whatever silence had once protected this place was breaking apart at the seams. He had stepped into something that measured consequences not in dollars alone, but in pressure and fear made visible. And as he turned back toward the shattered outline of the home that had once stood here, he knew with quiet, sinking certainty that the offer they had brought was only the first price he would be asked to pay. When money begins to sound like a threat, how much is a man truly being asked to surrender in exchange for his safety? The night came in without warning, quiet as a held breath, and just as dangerous. Samuel had been sitting at the small kitchen table with the lamp turned low, paperwork spread in front of him without purpose, when Shadow's body stiffened beside the door. The dog rose slowly, ears lifting, a low sound forming in his chest. Not yet a growl, not yet a bark, but something tense and alert that made Samuel's pulse change its rhythm before his mind fully understood why. He crossed to the window and looked out toward the dark edge of the road. At first there was nothing. Then he saw it. The distant flicker of orange where no light should be, small at first, trembling against the black like the beginning of a wound. His breath caught. It was the direction of the forgotten lot. The truck was moving before his thoughts finished forming. Gravel sprayed beneath the tires as he turned onto the narrow dirt track, headlights cutting pale tunnels through drifting dust and growing smoke. The scent reached him before the flames fully came into view, sharp, bitter, unmistakable. Fire. When the clearing opened suddenly before them, the old storage shed near the foundation was already burning in earnest, flames tearing up through the dry wood with an eager hunger that turned the night into violent daylight. Heat rolled across the open space in thick waves. Emily's car was there, its silhouette wreathed in smoke. And then he saw her, Emily standing several yards from the inferno, arms wrapped around herself in helpless horror, shouting Noah's name into the roar until her voice broke. Samuel's heart slammed painfully against his ribs. "Where is he?" he shouted as he leapt from the truck. Emily pointed toward the far side of the shed, sobbing too hard to speak. Shadow didn't wait for instructions. The dog surged forward at once, running straight into the smoke with a speed that carried both desperation and purpose. Samuel ran after him, covering his face as the heat pressed hard enough to sting his skin. The shed's door had already collapsed inward, flames crawling along the roof beams and raining sparks onto the ground. Inside, the world was reduced to choking gray and wild orange movement. He could hear Shadow somewhere ahead, barking sharply now, his voice cutting through the roar. "Shadow!" Samuel called, forcing himself deeper inside. His boots struck splintered wood and fallen tools. The heat was unbearable, licking at his arms, finding every inch of exposed skin. Then he heard it, a thin, terrified cry, buried beneath the sound of burning wood. Noah. Samuel dropped to his knees and crawled forward, lungs burning, eyes tearing so badly that the world had become little more than blurred shapes and dancing light. Shadow appeared suddenly through the smoke, his jaws clamped gently around the back of the boy's jacket. Noah's small body dragged awkwardly behind him, legs tangled against fallen debris. The beam above them cracked with a sound like tearing metal. "This way!" Samuel shouted hoarsely, reaching out. Shadow pulled once more with a powerful jerk, freeing Noah, then turned and pushed the child toward Samuel with the firm pressure of his head and shoulders. Samuel wrapped his arms around the boy and turned, blindly following Shadow's movements toward the door. The roof gave way just as they cleared the threshold, fire collapsing inward in a furious spray of sparks and embers that rushed into the air like something unleashed. They hit the ground outside in a tangle of limbs and smoke and breathless fear. Samuel rolled, shielding the child with his body until the worst of the heat was behind them. Emily screamed and ran to them, dropping to her knees and pulling Noah into her arms with sobs that shook her entire frame. The boy clung to her, coughing, alive. Shadow stood beside them, chest heaving, patches of fur singed and smoking, but his eyes were clear and steady despite the chaos. Samuel dropped to one knee beside them, one hand pressed hard against the ground, his lungs fighting to draw in air that didn't burn. For a long moment, none of them spoke. The fire raged on behind them, devouring what remained of the shed, as if determined to erase every trace of what it once held. When the worst of the heat subsided and the roof collapsed fully inward, Samuel forced himself to stand. His limbs trembled with the aftershock of what had almost been lost. He looked at Shadow, running his hands quickly over the dog's shoulders and flanks. "You hurt?" he asked roughly. Shadow whined softly, leaning into the touch, but made no sound of pain. Emily held Noah close, whispering his name again and again, as if afraid he might vanish if she stopped. Above them, the black sky seemed to press closer, heavy with smoke and unanswered questions. The fire had not started by accident. Samuel knew it with a clarity that settled cold and final in his chest. As the flames weakened and the immediate danger passed, a strange quiet followed, the kind that arrives after something violent has run out of strength. Samuel circled the scorched remains of the shed with slow, careful steps. Ash drifted down in pale flakes, settling over the ground like a mourning veil. He crouched near what had once been the back wall, shifting charred debris aside with a piece of fallen wood. That was when he saw it, half buried beneath blackened dirt and shattered glass, the dull glint of metal. He picked it up with 2 fingers, a spent bullet casing, warped slightly by heat, but unmistakable. Then another, and another. His stomach tightened as realization spread through him in a slow, sickening wave. This place had not only known fire, it had known violence. He worked methodically, uncovering more as the ash gave way. Flattened casings scattered in a rough arc, darkened stains on stones that fire had tried but failed to fully erase. The shape of it rose in his mind without needing to be named. A line of shots. Panic. The ground itself having once absorbed something it was never meant to hold. Samuel straightened slowly, the weight of the discovery pressing into his bones. Emily stood several yards away, still holding Noah, watching him with wide, stricken eyes. She had already understood. He saw it in the way her shoulders drew inward, the way her breath trembled as if memory had suddenly ripped free from its cage. "You knew," Samuel said quietly, not as accusation, but as truth finally spoken aloud. Emily's face crumpled. For a moment she tried to stand against the words, then the strength left her all at once. She sank onto the scorched ground, pulling Noah onto her lap, as if shielding him from the past itself. "They saw it," she whispered. The words barely carried over the fading crackle of fire. "My daughter and her husband. They were here that night. They didn't go looking. They just heard the noise and looked through the trees." Her breath shuddered violently. "They saw men arguing, then the shots, then someone falling." Tears ran down her face, unchecked. "They told the wrong people that they had seen it. And after that, everything changed." Samuel felt the words lodge deep inside him, heavy with meaning. "They were threatened," he said. Emily nodded, clutching Noah even tighter. "More than threatened," she said. "They were told to forget what they'd seen, to pretend it never happened. They were told what would happen to their child if they didn't." Her voice fractured so badly on the last word that it nearly disappeared. Samuel closed his eyes briefly, the old, familiar anger rising in him like a tide he had once learned to survive, but never to defeat. It was the same story, shaped with different faces. Silence bought with fear. Truth buried so deeply that it began to rot. "They tried to live anyway," Emily continued through tears. "They stayed quiet. They raised Noah. They told themselves they had done the only thing they could. But fear doesn't loosen its grip just because you obey it." She looked up at Samuel now, eyes raw and hollow. When they disappeared, some people said they had finally run away from the memory. Others said it was an accident, but I knew. She swallowed hard. This shed, it's where they hid what they could of that night. Not proof, just pieces of their courage that they didn't dare show to anyone else. Her gaze drifted to the smoking ruin behind him. Now that's gone too. Shadow moved quietly to Emily's side and lay down close enough that his warmth touched her leg. Noah, still shaking, reached out hesitantly and buried his fingers in the thick fur at the dog's neck. Shadow did not move, only breathed steadily, offering what comfort he could without words. Samuel watched the boy's breathing slowly begin to ease as he held on to the living proof that he had not been lost tonight. The fire had taken the shed, the keepsakes, the fragile shelter of memory, but it had failed to take the child. And in that failure, something dangerous had been defied. Samuel looked back at the scorched earth where the casings lay. The past was no longer just a weight in paper files and uneasy conversations. It had broken into the present with flame and near tragedy. Someone had tried to destroy more than wood this night. They had tried to erase what little trace of the truth still existed. And now, that truth had instead burned brighter for a fleeting, terrible moment before settling into something that could no longer be ignored. Samuel felt it press against him from every side. This was the line. The one a man crossed when the silence became more costly than fear. He turned back to Emily. "What you've kept quiet all these years," he said slowly, "no longer belongs only to those who tried to bury it." Emily wiped her face with trembling hands. "I never wanted Noah to inherit this," she said. "I only wanted him to be safe." Samuel looked at the boy, then at the dog pressed protectively against him. "So do I," he answered. The meaning behind the words went deeper than either of them could yet measure. The flames had died down to glowing embers now, the night settling into a thick, smoky stillness. Sirens did not come. No neighbors rushed the scene. The clearing belonged only to them and the weight of what had been revealed. Samuel stood at the edge of the ash and looked into the dark beyond the reach of the firelight. Somewhere out there, people knew exactly what had been done on this ground, and what had just been uncovered again in the most violent way possible. He drew a slow breath, feeling the shift inside himself as the last lingering uncertainty fell away. Whatever lay ahead, it would not turn back into silence on its own. And as the embers cooled behind him, one thought echoed with troubling clarity. Now that the truth had shown itself in fire, who would move to extinguish it next? The days after the fire did not bring relief. They brought waiting. The kind of waiting that stretched the nerves thin and turned every ordinary sound into a question. The first call came 2 nights later, long after the town had folded itself into sleep. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times before Samuel reached it from the kitchen. When he lifted the receiver, only static answered at first. Then slow breathing, deliberate, measured, close enough that it made his skin tighten. No words followed, just breath, steady and unafraid, as if the caller were enjoying the space between sound and silence. Samuel did not speak either. He waited, listening. After a few seconds, the line went dead. Shadow was already at the door, body rigid, ears pricked forward, a low warning vibrating in his chest. "I know," Samuel murmured, more to steady himself than the dog. He checked the locks, turned off the remaining lights, and sat in the dark until his pulse returned to something near its usual rhythm. By morning, he told himself, it was only the beginning. The second sign came not through sound, but through absence. Emily called that afternoon, her voice careful, strained. "Someone was outside last night," she said quietly. "I didn't see them, but I heard the gravel shift. And when I looked this morning, the gate to the yard was open." Samuel closed his eyes briefly. He could see the place clearly in his mind. The quiet slope of grass, the line of trees at the far edge, the narrow path where shadows gathered even in daylight. "Did you call anyone?" he asked. "No," she answered after a pause. "I don't think they want witnesses." That night, he drove to her house without hesitation. The decision felt less like a choice and more like the next inevitable step in a path that had already narrowed. Shadow rode with his head high, watching the dark slip past the windows with unwavering focus. From that point on, the pattern became unmistakable. A call at midnight that rang only once. Footsteps that never fully announced themselves, but left subtle proof by morning. Disturbed soil near the fence. The faint scent of unfamiliar smoke on the wind. The sound of a car idling somewhere just beyond the reach of the porch light. Samuel slept little. Shadow slept even less. The dog took up his place each night at the front door, stretched along the threshold like a living barrier, every sense trained outward. He rose at the slightest shift in sound, his head lifting, a growl gathering and fading again as threats passed close but did not cross the line. Samuel spent the dark hours sitting nearby, jacket still on, one hand resting occasionally on the dog's broad back. The old feeling had returned fully now, the one that lived not in fear, but in preparation. He knew this territory well. What unsettled him was not the danger itself, but the quiet clarity with which it had chosen its targets. Emily tried to be brave. During the day, she kept her voice, steady for Noah, fixed his breakfast, walked him to the small bus stop at the corner as if nothing in the world had changed. But when the sun fell and the shadows lengthened, the strain showed through the careful arrangement of her calm. She watched the road too often, listened too hard for sounds that did not fully arrive. One evening, as they sat in her living room with the lights turned low, Noah asleep on the sofa, with Shadow curled at his feet, Emily finally gave voice to the question she had been holding. "You could walk away," she said softly. "No one would blame you." Samuel did not answer at once. He looked at the child, at the slow rise and fall of his chest, at the dog's alert stillness, even in rest. "I could," he replied, "but that doesn't mean I should." Emily studied his face in the lamplight, as if seeing him fully for the first time. It was then that she began to understand what kind of man stood beside her. Not through stories of past service, which he never offered, but through the quiet completeness with which he accepted the risk now unfolding around them. He did not speak in the language of heroes or of sacrifice. He spoke in the simple terms of presence, of staying when leaving would be easier, of standing where fear wanted space cleared. One night, after another long vigil, broken only by the distant echo of unseen movement outside, Emily said, You've done this before. Samuel met her gaze without surprise. Yes, he said. She nodded slowly. Not selling houses, she added. He gave the faintest hint of a smile. No, he agreed. Not that. For a moment, the quiet between them was no longer empty. It held recognition, respect, and something more fragile beginning to form beneath both. The pressure did not lessen. A note was slipped beneath the door one morning while Emily had taken Noah to the store. No signature, no name. Just a short message written in block letters so plain they almost pretended to innocence. You can still leave. Samuel read it once, then twice, before folding it carefully and sliding it into his pocket. He did not show it to Emily. Not yet. By now, the message no longer needed words. It lived in every watched shadow, every delayed sound. Life itself had begun to feel like a negotiation conducted in threat and implication. Emily sensed the weight of it even without seeing the paper. They're waiting for something, she said one evening, as Samuel replaced the batteries in the porch light. For me to run? He shook his head. For me to. That was the choice at the heart of it, bare and unadorned. If he withdrew, the pressure might fade. If he stayed, it would harden. And he understood with unsettling clarity that Emily and the child were no longer collateral. They had become leverage. The thought settled darkly in his chest. That night, after Noah had been tucked away and Shadow had resumed his silent watch at the door, Samuel stood alone in the kitchen, the soft glow of a single bulb reflected in the window's black glass. For the first time since all of this had begun, he allowed himself to imagine what walking away would look like. The quiet return of routines, the slow healing of sleeplessness, a life that could narrow again to manageable distances. And then he pictured Emily standing alone in that same quiet, listening for sounds that did not yet carry names. He exhaled slowly once. The decision had already settled before his mind finished circling it. Emily felt the change in him without being told. It showed in the stillness of his movements, in the way his gaze now carried something steadier than tension alone. One evening as they stood at the back window, watching the dark settle over the yard like a held breath, she said, "You're not leaving, are you?" He shook his head. The answer did not need words. Something softened in her expression that Samuel had not seen since the night before the fire. It was not relief exactly. It was trust, thin, cautious, but unmistakable. Their hands brushed briefly as they both reached to lower the blinds. Neither pulled away at once. The contact lingered only a second longer than necessity required, but it was enough to name what neither of them yet dared to speak aloud. Shadow remained the constant through it all. Each night, he lay watchful at the threshold, reacting to every faint scrape of sound outside with a low warning that faded only when the threat withdrew back into unseen distance. Once, near dawn, he surged suddenly against the door with a sharp bark that brought Samuel to his feet in an instant. They stood, listening together, heartbeats loud in the quiet. Somewhere beyond the porch, snow-crusted gravel shifted under retreating steps. No words, no confrontation. Only the message, delivered again, without language. We are still here. When Samuel eased the door open later, there was nothing to see. Only the pale wash of early light across an empty yard. But the knowledge lingered thicker than any physical trace. In the days that followed, Emily began to meet Samuel's gaze more readily. She studied him with something like wonder now, as if the shape of his courage unsettled her as deeply as the shape of his danger. "You don't have to protect us," she said once, not pleading, only stating. Samuel tightened the strap of his jacket and looked at her steadily. "No," he said, "but I will." The simplicity of it left no room for argument. Later that night, as they sat together in the dim hush after Noah had gone to sleep, Emily spoke again in a voice barely louder than breath. "You make it feel possible," she said, "that we might come out of this still standing." Samuel did not answer at once. When he did, it was quietly. "So do you." Outside, unseen watchers measured the slow passing of hours. Inside, something delicate and stubborn was taking shape between two people who had long learned to survive without leaning on hope. The threats had not broken them. They had bound them instead, lightly at first, in the shared weight of danger and the unspoken agreement of presence. Samuel understood the cost of this choice as clearly as he understood its necessity. He had crossed into a space where retreat no longer meant safety, only abandonment. And now, as shadow settled once more at the door and the night pressed close on all sides, he knew the bargain had already been struck. If he took one more step forward, would there be any path left that truly led back? Samuel released the rumor like a stone dropped into dark water, quietly, precisely, and only where it would ripple the farthest. He let it slip through conversations that were never meant to be private, hinted at documents that would reach the police by morning, evidence pulled from places long assumed clean. The lie was shaped carefully around truth, just enough to sound dangerous. By dusk, he felt the night tightening its grip, as if the land itself had been listening. He brought Emily and Noah back to the edge of the abandoned property under the pretense of checking the perimeter one last time, his movements steady, his voice calm. Shadow sensed the shift long before the sky finished darkening. The dog paced in short, tense lines, nostrils flaring at the wind, ears slicing every sound into meaning. Samuel's hand brushed the rough fur between Shadow's shoulders, grounding them both. "Not yet," he murmured. He guided Emily and the child toward the shallow ravine behind the collapsed fence line, where brush and shadow layered thick enough to swallow their shapes. Emily's hands trembled as she held Noah close, her eyes never leaving Samuel's face. "I'll come back," he told her quietly. She nodded once, trusting him with a courage that scared her more than fear. Then he turned away, and the night closed in around him. The first movement came from the trees, too deliberate for animals, too quiet for men without intent. Shadow's growl rose, low and elastic, a wire pulled tight. Samuel felt the shift behind his ribs where training lived. He stepped forward into the open, knowing the ground was chosen not for safety, but for sightlines. A figure detached from the darkness near the rusted outbuilding, then another, then the heavier silhouette that moved with ownership rather than caution. The man who stepped into view was in his late 50s, broad through the chest, a permanent slouch in one shoulder, as if violence had once demanded more than his body was built to give. His face was square and pale under the weak spill of moonlight, mouth set in a habit of command rather than speech. Gray hair shorn close to the skull gave him the look of efficiency grown old without remorse. The others hovered at angles behind him, watchers rather than equals. "You made it public," the man said without greeting, his voice flat and unimpressed. "That was a mistake." Samuel met his gaze without flinching. So was killing for silence. The man's mouth curved, faintly. "Still pretending this is about the past? It's about what people will believe in the morning." He lifted a hand slightly, and the shadows shifted closer. Shadow moved first, not in anger, but in calculation. The dog burst forward with a suddenness that shattered the night's held breath, driving hard at the nearest figures, teeth flashing, weight colliding. The attackers scattered just enough for Samuel to run the other way, back toward the ravine, back toward the pieces of his life he could still protect. He heard Emily's breath catch somewhere below as he shoved them deeper into cover. "Stay down," he whispered fiercely. "No matter what." Then he turned again toward the center of the trap as Shadow reappeared from the dark, snapping, circling, keeping distance from weapons they were careful not to reveal yet. A sharp crack split the air. Shadow staggered, twisted, then found his footing again with a broken snarl that cut through Samuel's chest like ice. Blood darkened the fur along the dog's flank, bright even in poor light. Samuel's heart stuttered once, violently. He forced his voice steady. "Shadow, back!" The dog hesitated, just an instant too long, then obeyed enough to reposition between Samuel and the man in charge, posture still defiant despite the wound. The kingpin stepped forward, impatience now visible at the edges of his control. "You couldn't just sell and disappear," he said. "You had to make it righteous." He raised his arm, a pistol catching the moon's thin gleam. Samuel felt the terrain narrow to a tunnel of intention and consequence. He moved without thinking, years of reflex overtaking dread. The flare of pain bloomed hot along his shoulder as the shot tore past close enough to steal heat. He went down hard behind the low concrete footing of an old foundation, his breath driven out in a ragged burst. Across the clearing, Shadow lunged again, not at the men this time, but toward Samuel, placing his body squarely between gun and master. Another shot cracked. The dog collapsed with a sound Samuel would never forget. For a moment, the world reduced to the sight of that stillness. Then the kingpin laughed once, sharp and short. "That should settle it," he said. Samuel felt the ground tilt beneath him as he crawled across broken gravel to reach Shadow. The dog's chest still moved, shallow and uneven. Samuel's hands shook as he pressed against the bleeding, whispering the dog's name like a prayer he didn't fully believe he deserved to speak anymore. The kingpin advanced a step, weapon steady. "You sent for help," he said. "They won't make it in time." Samuel's phone lay face down in the dirt beside him, screen dark. The last signal had already gone out an hour ago, the one he'd triggered the moment the first shadow moved. Now, it was only a question of distance and minutes. A sound rolled in from far off. At first, indistinct, then unmistakable. Sirens. Not close yet, but real. The kingpin's expression tightened. "Too slow," he muttered, adjusting his aim. Shadow moved again, impossibly, dragging himself against the weight of his own failing strength, placing that wounded body where a bullet would travel before it ever reached Samuel. No, Samuel breathed. He surged up from the ground, closing the distance in a rush that cost him what breath he had left. The shot went wild as he collided with the man's chest, both of them crashing into the dust in a tangle of arms and fury. The pistol skidded away into the dark. The kingpin was stronger than his age suggested, fueled by a lifetime of endings that never touched him directly. They grappled in the churned earth, fists finding flesh, breath tearing at lungs already on fire. In the struggle, Samuel saw Emily's face in his mind, silent, watching, and Noah's small shape folded into shadow. He saw shadow, as he had been before the night taught him pain, and then he chose. He drove his weight forward with everything he had left, not to punish, not even to win, but to hold, to keep the man from reaching the weapon. The kingpin fought with a snarling sound of panic now, a smell of fear cutting sharp through dust and sweat. The sirens swelled nearer, multiplied. Red and blue light began to strobe against the trees, painting the clearing in hard pulses of consequence. Samuel's strength slipped in and out like a failing current, but he didn't let go until hands pulled the kingpin away. Firm, professional, armed with certainty. Voices called orders Samuel barely heard. Someone knelt beside Shadow. Someone else pressed against Samuel's bleeding shoulder, anchoring him in the present with practiced calm. He turned his head at the sound of Emily running, saw her break from hiding with Noah clutched to her side. Her face was empty of words when she reached him, hands shaking as she touched his cheek, his jacket, as if counting him back into the world. "He's alive," a medic said, about Shadow, voice brisk and merciful. "Barely, but alive." Samuel closed his eyes then, the weight of the night finally finding space to fall through him. The kingpin was hauled upright in cuffs behind him. His face changed now, smaller, without command to lean on. Sirens continued to cry against the dark, as if the land itself were mourning and absolving at once. And still, in the space where Shadow should have been standing on his own 4 feet, there was only blood and the memory of a body that had chosen him over itself. As the lights crowded closer and the threat at last was drawn into human hands, one fear remained unquiet in Samuel's chest. If Shadow did not rise again, would the strength that carried him through this night still be enough to carry what came after? Shadow survived. The word reached Samuel in the gray hush just before dawn, spoken softly by a nurse whose eyes held both fatigue and kindness. The surgery had taken most of the night. The bullet had torn deep, but missed what it needed to miss by a margin so narrow it still felt unreal. Samuel stood frozen for a moment in the hospital corridor, one hand braced against the wall as if gravity had suddenly grown unreliable. Then the weight that had been locked inside his chest since the clearing finally broke free. He did not cover his face when the tears came. He did not try to slow them. At nearly 60 years old, after years of training himself to hold emotion like breath underwater, he let it rise without shame. When they allowed him into the recovery room, the first light of morning was spilling through the blinds in thin gold bands. Shadow lay motionless beneath the sheets, bandaged and smaller somehow, but breathing. When the dog's eyes finally fluttered open and fixed, unfocused at first, then steadied on Samuel's face, something ancient and unguarded tore through him. He sank into the chair at the bedside and laughed through the ache in his throat. "You came back," he whispered. Shadow's tail shifted faintly under the blankets, just enough. It was enough to remake the world. Days moved forward after that, slow at first, then with gathering rhythm. The kingpin was held without bond. The arrest had cracked open a sealed history that the town had learned to step around instead of through. Old files were pulled from dust-heavy drawers. Witnesses who had lived for years with words locked behind their teeth were suddenly willing to speak. Names that had only ever traveled as rumor were printed now in official ink. One by one, the families tied to those silent cases were called, questioned again, not as suspects this time, but as people finally allowed to be heard. For Emily, the phone call came on a quiet afternoon while she sat in the hospital corridor with Noah coloring on the floor at her feet. The voice on the other end told her that the investigation into the death her family had witnessed years ago had been formally reopened, that the truth, buried under threats and influence for so long, was finally safe to surface. She did not cry at first. She simply closed her eyes and breathed as if air itself had just been returned to her. The hearing came weeks later. Samuel sat in the back beside Emily, Shadow resting on a padded mat between their feet, still weak but alert, one ear flicking at every sound. The courtroom was not large, but it was full. Faces Samuel had only ever seen in passing were now shaped by grief given permission to stand in daylight. When the charges were read, a murmur moved through the room, some quiet relief, some raw disbelief. When the families were formally named as victims rather than questions, the sound changed. Emily's shoulders shook silently beside him. Samuel did not speak. He simply placed his hand over hers on the wooden bench and left it there. Afterward, outside beneath a sky cleared by spring rain, a woman Emily had not seen in nearly a decade stepped forward and embraced her with both arms, sobbing without restraint. No words passed between them that day that could have carried more meaning than that alone. The land changed hands not long after. Samuel stood on the edge of it one last time in the early light, wearing the red and black jacket that had become as constant as his breath, Shadow at his side, Emily a few steps behind, with Noah tracing circles in the dirt with a stick. He had signed the papers the afternoon before. The money from the sale would not be large compared to what might have been claimed by developers or private interests. But that had never been the point. The organization he had chosen worked with children displaced by loss and violence. Quiet work, steady work, the kind that did not announce itself with banners. In the months ahead, the broken soil would become a foundation, not for profit, but for refuge. A place where children, like Noah, would learn that not every hard beginning decided the shape of what followed. As the sun rose higher, Samuel felt no regret at letting the land go. It had given him its truth. That was enough. The mornings changed after that. They became simpler, quieter, the kind of quiet that did not hide things but held them gently. Shadow healed in deliberate stages, first standing, then walking, then running again in short, joyful bursts that left Samuel grinning despite himself. Emily moved through the days with a different posture now, still careful, but no longer folded inward against disaster. Noah returned to school, safe in the small, predictable rituals that slowly rebuilt trust. And each morning, just after sunrise, Samuel buttoned his jacket, fastened the old military watch at his wrist, and stepped onto the porch with Shadow at his side. Often, Emily joined them, a thermos in hand, the steam rising between them as they walked the edge of town together. They did not need to speak much. Their companionship filled the silence without disturbing it. For the first time in years, Samuel noticed the town again without scanning it for threat. He noticed the way light caught the bakery window at the corner, the way the river changed voice depending on the weather, the way Shadow's steps had regained their confident rhythm. He noticed, too, the way his own body carried tension differently now, not gone, but no longer consuming the whole center of him. One evening, as they sat side by side on Emily's porch, watching the last colors drain from the sky, she said quietly, "You didn't have to stay." Samuel looked at her then, not as someone in danger, not as someone to be guarded, but as someone choosing him as clearly as he had chosen her. "I know," he said. She nodded, satisfied. That was all that needed to be said. The past did not vanish. It lived on in paperwork, in anniversaries, in names, spoken now with memory rather than dread. It lived in Shadow's faint limp on colder days. It lived in the way Emily sometimes paused at loud, sudden sounds. It lived in the parts of Samuel that remained shaped by seasons he would never fully leave behind. But it no longer owned the future. The future belonged to mornings, to long walks, to the sound of a child laughing in a yard that had once held only fear. It belonged to the scent of coffee on cold air. It belonged to the steady weight of a dog's head resting against a waiting knee. On the morning that marked nearly a year since the night of the trap, Samuel stood in his kitchen, looking out at the pale spring light gathering beyond the window. Shadow lay at his feet, fully recovered now, his breathing slow and even. Emily's car pulled into the drive a moment later. When she stepped inside, she was smiling without effort. "Ready?" she asked. Samuel nodded. He reached for his jacket, slid his arms into the familiar weight of it, and felt, for the first time in a long while, that the man wearing it was not just surviving, but arriving somewhere at last. They walked together down the quiet street, three figures and one steady shadow, toward a life that did not need to prove itself through danger anymore. And in the gentle hush between their footsteps, Samuel understood that he had not escaped war by running from it, but by choosing, at last, where his loyalty truly belonged. Sometimes, what we call a miracle is simply the moment we choose to stand instead of run, to love instead of fear, to believe instead of surrender. In Shadow's survival, in Samuel's second chance, we are reminded that God's hand often moves quietly, through loyalty, through courage, through ordinary people who refuse to give up. If this story touched your heart, let it remind you that no life is ever too broken for grace to find it again. Please share this story with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment with what this journey meant to you, and subscribe to our channel for more stories of faith, courage, and healing. May God bless you, protect your loved ones, and fill your days with light, now and always.